Well, I would say there are very few small companies, startup companies that have been successful in bringing drugs from early research development through, well, providing a proof of concept, um, which is sometimes referred to as phase zero, basically then deciding, yes, this is a drug candidate that can actually work, then developing this through early stage clinical trials, phase one, phase two, and then to late stage clinical trials and then marketing, because that whole process takes up to 12 years and investments of several hundred millions. If you count the failures in, probably more than $1 billion in development costs. So very few companies have been able to do this, to go through the whole value chain of drug development. Of course, in Switzerland, there are some lighthouse projects or companies that managed to do this, but some of them also started from a very good base. Actelion is one that started with very mature products already from the Roche pipeline. There's also the company Serono in Switzerland that actually managed to develop drugs from early concept through clinical trials and to market, and therefore was later on acquired by Merck for a lot of money. So now it's known as Merck Serono. So very few companies manage to go through the whole process. Startup companies that are financed by venture capital investors very often develop things to a certain value inflection point, which means a technology platform has to be validated, that it can be deployed, that it can work, that you can license the technology and somebody gives you money for this. So this is technology, platform development, license strategy. Or you develop drugs to a point that you manufacture the drug in a way that you can test it in clinical trials, and you create the data in clinical trials that your drug can potentially work in patients. And that is a highly attractive value proposition for pharma companies because they are very versed in then bringing these early drug candidates through late-stage clinical trials, which involves thousands of patients and needs usually an upscaling in the drug manufacturing, and also preparing the drug for commercialization and to putting this out for hundreds of thousands of patients. So preparing the whole marketing of drugs, this is extremely difficult for small companies to accomplish. These days, as the drug development gets more personalized and more specific for particular targets and the patient populations get smaller and smaller, there are companies out there who manage to bring a drug through all phases of clinical development if it, for example, addresses a niche indication of maybe 20,000 patients globally, 10,000 patients globally, because then you don't need to scale the manufacturing to a large scale, which is very often very expensive. But by and large, you try to provide this prototype or proof of concept for your technology, your innovation, your drug, that somebody else can actually take it commercial. But there are exceptions to the rule that I mentioned, like Serono or Actelion in Switzerland, who actually went all the way and are fully integrated companies. Of course, in Europe, there are a few more biotech companies who made it all the way through, sometimes also due to developments that were not foreseeable. I think big example is Biotech. This was the COVID-19 pandemic where, their technology was the perfect solution to develop vaccines very quickly and to scale it with partners very quickly. And they became very profitable in a short period of time and went all the way through. Again, not alone, but with Pfizer as a big pharma partner. And there are companies in the United States who are household names these days. Genentech, Biogen, although Biogen started in Switzerland originally, but American companies that took tens of years to come to a point that they finally developed drugs for the market, but they also consumed hundreds of millions of funding before they reached this point of time. And this is the exception of the rule. I think very often companies, especially when they have early stage investors, need to come to an exit point within a 5 to 10 year time frame. And that is often not sufficient to bring drugs to the market. The specific example of NBE and the exit that we achieved for more than $1 billion, which was really outstanding and fantastic for all stakeholders in the company. Yes, was part of the business plan to have this exit by a trade sale. But for a long period of time, and I mentioned that before, our solution to create better ADCs was looked at as interesting, academically interesting, but maybe not so much a need that was required at that point of time in the market. It took quite a while until one or two pharma companies became more interested in that concept and said, well, we would invest a little bit time and resources in exploring this. And I think there were two catalysts that positioned NBE really for a trade sale. One was that there was a smaller American biotech company that was looking to get into the field of antibody-drug conjugate development, but didn't have a technology platform themselves. They were willing to take the risk to take our preclinically validated technology platform for their own clinical development programs. That, of course, included the toxin platform as well, the conjugation and the toxin platform. And they paid us 20 million upfront, which for, a company that had raised about 30 million was a significant amount of money. Essentially, it allowed the company to basically say, well, we don't need to raise money for the next year and even utilize some of that free cash for our own drug development activities. So this was catalyst number one. And I think this is a common theme. If you have an outside validation by, let's say, a reputable company that puts money on the table for your innovation, well, there must be something real to it, right? Somebody is paying money for it. So this validation of your technology, your product, whatever you're developing, is something that has a much higher value than the money that you actually get into the company. So even if we had received 10 million, 5 million, it would have been an outside validation of a third-party company, unrelated, that validates the concept that you have been working on. So I think this is super important, and it's a commercial validation of your idea and your strategy. And I think the second catalyst was that as we were developing our platform and getting papers out and proof of concept out and gearing up for starting our clinical trials, there was a competitor of ours developing a product exactly against the same target that we had targeted with a different platform. And they were also very outspoken about this. They were actually sold to another US pharma company for $2.3 billion US dollars. So, and they were actually selling the product candidate that we have been developing in the clinic also with early clinical data. So a second catalyst was coming from the outside, that, another deal happened in this antibody-drug conjugate field that was really looked at by many companies, and they said, wow, there's a big pharma company that invests a lot of money in going after that target. NBE-Therapeutics is also going after that target, and it's pretty much the same stage of development. Maybe these guys were a little bit further ahead, but they were also in a slightly different indication. And all of a sudden, we were in the focus of attention of big pharma companies that rejected us many times before because we were academically interesting. It was an interesting concept, but not something that the pharma companies believed could really be implemented on a larger scale. And maybe the last third catalyst was that by external contractors, we executed the transition into clinical validation and the manufacturing of the antibody-drug conjugates with this enzymatic SMAC technology. We implemented this very quickly, and the quality of our ADCs in terms of characterization of the drugs were outstanding, were very high quality, exactly as we had advertised, that the chemical conjugation was inadequate, would not give products with very good product profile. So we had a lot of data to convince that we had a good platform. Catalyst number one, a company that already licensed the technology and externally validated our technology. Even if if out of this collaboration there was no data yet published, and of course it's still all confidential, But there was this outside validation. A competitor of ours working essentially on the same project was acquired. And we had actually proven that our technology platform can be scaled and can work and gives really superior product candidates. And then starting clinical trials. So transitioning this in a short period of time into a clinical validation. And this is usually the sweet spot where pharma companies then like to take this under their own wings. And clearly, this is also traditionally and historically where pharma companies spend the most money in filling their pipelines, because their own pipeline development maybe is not so much under pressure, or there are more people involved and everything goes a little bit slower than in a startup environment where it's do or die, and you have limited resources and you have to come up with the solutions in the shortest time possible. If you develop antibody-drug conjugates, which was the focus of NBE-Therapeutics, this is quite a complex technology that you have to implement and deploy commercially, because you need to manufacture an antibody, you need to manufacture a small molecule toxin or drug, and then you have to have a technology that conjugates these two components together. Then you have an antibody-drug conjugate, but this also needs to be manufactured in a way that it's at the end what is called a drug product. So something that is filled up in little vials that can be shipped to clinics or to sites where the patients are being treated. So the whole process of manufacturing these antibody-drug conjugates is a 5 or 6 step process, which all has to be done under what is called good manufacturing practice, which means under sterile conditions, under highest safety precautions. Smaller startup companies are required to intensively work with external contractors, CDMOs, so contract development manufacturing organizations, but in some aspects also CROs, contract research organizations, where a lot of the work is done under certain quality standards that are not easily implemented in a small biotech environment. So a large part of our work was to actually scout for the right contractors and external vendors, as they are also called, who could help us in scaling the manufacturing process and establishing the manufacturing process already with the idea in mind that they have to be able to manufacture for the market, and not only for 20, 50, 100 patients in a clinical trial, but maybe for 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 patients in the marketplace. We tested a lot of manufacturers and found our preferred partner, which I think this was published and is well known, was actually WuXi Biologics in China, which was quite a risk for a small Swiss biotech company to go so far abroad and to Asia, and particularly to China, to implement the whole manufacturing process for our antibody-drug conjugates. Because we controlled one important step of the process ourselves, which was the enzyme for the conjugation that was not manufactured in China, that was manufactured in Europe, but all other components were manufactured in China, including the final antibody-drug conjugates. So when the big pharma partner, when they did their due diligence on our company, saw that we had worked with one of the household names in the industry that can potentially supply market, or supply the drug for the market, that was, I think, a big factor in the trade sale, because I think we could convince the pharma partner that they can build on this process and don't need to establish this in-house or kind of completely establish the process themselves. So we did have a manufacturing partner that could be utilized, and they could simply manufacture the product for the market if desired. But there was also flexibility in the contract, so we could transfer the process also out without any restrictions to any kind of manufacturing facility that the big pharma partner would like and favor. This concept of preparing the product for market entry is not to be underestimated with big pharma companies. And this was part of the planning that we said, okay, if we want to sell the company to a big pharma company, we have to, create the logistics and the manufacturing and the system in a way that the pharma company can take it over without any major hurdle. And this is what we achieved. Well, there was a little bit of sentiment that the technology might not be safe in China, and our product manufacturing might not be safe in China. And well, I had to use a lot of, let's say, legwork in going to China, negotiating the contracts, looking at the facilities, liaising with the management team of WuXi Biologics, and then relaying the information back to the stakeholders in the company and the investors and the board members that, in fact, there is a high level of sensitivity at WuXi Biologics with their US-based and European customers base to preserve the IP rights and the knowledge and the know-how of the customer so that this would not end up somewhere in a Chinese company in no time. Because, of course, that is a little bit the sentiment that Western companies have, that their innovations can very quickly be copied in the East. And I think it's something that has happened in the past. But WuXi Biologics, I convinced myself that this is a highly credible organization. And in the end, I could convince our stakeholders. But this is exactly what I mentioned before, that one has to come to a common ground and understand where, let's say, reservations, maybe some skepticism, that was the word I was looking for, skepticism of the stakeholders comes from. And if you understand it, if you address it, if you provide then the information, how the information is being protected, then I could convince the stakeholders that this is the way to go. One of the private investors actually had business relationships with WuXi Biologics before. So that was a little bit of reinforcement, or let's say reassurance for the other investors that at least, I mean, there have been positive experiences in business relationships before. That was certainly helpful. But I personally invested a lot of time in going to Asia and collecting the right information in order to bring this back to Europe, because not all investors can go at the same time and reassure themselves and making on-site visits. So they had to trust management that they have done their homework and due diligence and made sure, based on a contractual basis in speaking to the stakeholders in the CDMO, that the patents and the innovation would be safe with this partner. And yeah, that was a process that took some time, but it was a good decision, and again, one that we took then together. And at the end, I think it was very positive. NBE is often now presented as a positive case study by WuXi Biologics on conferences themselves, how well they enable small companies to become successful because they have the commercial manufacturing capacities as well. Drug development companies, and especially investors supporting drug development companies, always advertise that companies should develop drugs in the United States for two reasons. One is it's one of the biggest pharma markets. And if you have large patient populations and you have a reimbursement system that also, well, the health insurance system can pay for the expensive drugs. So there's a big market for innovative drugs. There is also the advantage that the United States Food and Drug Administration, the US FDA, is very efficient in their process of reviewing and approving certain steps in a drug development process. For example, if you want to do a first-in-human clinical trial in the United States, there's a defined time period when you hand in your investigational drug application, your IND, to the US FDA. In 30 days, in 1 month, you get the feedback whether your clinical trial application is okay and you can move forward. In Europe, unfortunately, it can take up to 150 days. That's almost half a year until you get your approval. That, of course, depends on the modality, but it's now a centralized procedure from the European Medicines Agency, the EMA, So every clinical trial application, and this is a change that has occurred only recently, has to be handed in or filed with the European Medicines Agency. They take 105 days until they come back with their feedback. So that's already more than 3 months. And if it's a special, let's say, drug modality like we are developing at TCurix, so-called ATMPs, Advanced Therapeutic Medicinal Products, ATMPs, they can take another 50 days on top of that in order to come to a decision to start a clinical trial. So that's a huge disadvantage, 30 days versus 150 days, in where you're just waiting until the health authorities take a look at your dossier and decide whether you can move forward with your clinical trial. Therefore, a lot of the biotech companies are very early on considering going to the United States for the clinical trials, which not only is good for the companies, but US patients have much more access to the innovative therapies than European patients because, well, in 90% of the cases, you go to the United States to validate your early drug. And I think this is something that has to change in Europe. Europe has to become more competitive time-wise with the United States in order to approve early-stage clinical trials with human patients. With the later stage clinical trials, I think this goes more or less equally efficiently, although Europe doesn't know the concept of breakthrough therapies and fast-track designation. So everything goes according to a defined process, and there's no way to accelerate. In the United States, you can apply for fast-track designation, which we actually did at NBE-Therapeutics, and we have actually received fast-track designation for our drug. And if you provide clinical data that shows that your drug is really a breakthrough for a particular disease, then you can apply for breakthrough designation and you get accelerated approval even without going in very expensive and time-consuming phase 3 clinical trials. So I would say the United States and the US FDA is much more supportive in bringing very innovative drugs very quickly forwards in clinical development and then to the market. And of course, this is highly attractive for every pharma company, whether you are in the United States or whether you're developing your drugs in Europe. Well, at TCurix, we now go the way to do the clinical trials in Europe first, but this is simply because we have this very complex autologous cellular therapy or CAR T-cell therapy where we need to extract the cells from the patients, do the manufacturing locally, and then bring it back. Of course, we could say, well, we do a clinical trial in the United States and we manufacture here and we ship the material over to the United States. But let's say the logistics are a little bit more complex. So we just keep our fingers crossed that the quality of our clinical trial application will be so high that maybe we get a faster review of the documents and a faster acceptance of the clinical trials. But it's quite a difference between Europe and also European countries that are not part of the EMA procedure, like Switzerland. Quite a difference in the approval process times, US versus Europe. I think Switzerland is catching up significantly with Swissmedic because they don't need to adhere to the European process. The approval would go with Swissmedic alone. And they have recently really improved their processes and their timelines. A few high-level takeaways. First, run into the clinic as quickly as you can. Get clinical data on or clinical validation of your technology or your drug development candidate, because this is where then investors become very interested if you have a drug that has a certain level of clinical validation, because this is what pharma companies like to take into their own hands and to develop this further. This is where you get this hockey stick increase in valuation when all of a sudden you get clinical validation. Because everyone knows that the translation from a non-clinical cell culture model or maybe an early animal model to human patients is a big leap. I think in probably 80-90% of the cases, it does not translate what you see preclinically in the clinic. So if you have mastered that hurdle, and if you have clinical data, your company is in a much better position to get follow-on financing from investors to position the company for either IPO or trade sale, or to position your company and your product with pharma companies. Secondly, I think it's very important to get the validation of an outside partner in, well, really paying money, either a license fee or an acquisition of a product for your innovation, because that provides an external validation that this is actually a commercially valuable asset. And then there's even a price tag attached to it. So if somebody puts a couple of million on the table for your technology, even if it's an early stage validation, this outside validation is highly attractive, of course, for investors, because they see, yes, there's a real value in the solution that you have created. So this, I would say, is take-home message number 2. I think take-home message number 3 is, don't be too secretive about the innovation and where you stand in the development process. Yes, the competition is watching you, especially if you're successful. There's always the danger that with more resources at hand, they might actually overtake you on the right lane. So this is potentially dangerous, but if nobody knows about what you're working on, and you don't get the validation to be invited on conferences to present this to a broader audience, you will not raise the attention of pharma companies or, let's say, bigger stakeholders in the industry. In my first company, I think we were too secretive about our innovation. In the second company, we said, screw it, we just talk about what we are doing, and we just have to be faster than the competition in order to be successful. Well, the competitor of ours, who was sold a little bit earlier than us, they started late, and I think they did look at us very carefully and maybe took some concepts from us. But nevertheless, that was even a positive that they made fast progress and got acquired. So at the end, it panned out all positively. But if you're too secretive, if you're not telling stakeholders in the industry and potential future acquirers what you're doing, and if you're not publishing about this, then you don't have the credibility either. So we always said we publish 1 paper per year so that the community can see, and this was publishing in peer-reviewed journals, so that there was an external peer review from academic experts on our publications. Of course, you have to first file the patent application and then publish. But I think the publication in peer-reviewed scientific journals adds a lot to the credibility. And I think American companies like Genentech, Amgen, they do that as well. They publish their research, and that adds to a scientific credibility. And it actually makes it easier if companies have questions, due diligence questions on the technology. Say, well, take the paper. It's all described in the paper. Take a look yourself. And it's even peer-reviewed. So reviewers have looked at the data is actually solid. Yeah, this is very important. And maybe we talked about this, the 4th one. Prepare the company for the manufacturing in a way that it can be directly taken commercial. This is an incredible value for pharma companies, that they don't need to reinvent the manufacturing process. So if those 4 elements are around, and then of course you're in a favorable market environment, then things fall into place nicely.